so please join me in welcoming Dr. Harrison Jones. Harry is an applied field ecologist working at the intersection of community ecology, landscape ecology, population ecology, and conservation biology. He has a deep passion for bird conservation, and his research projects have addressed changes to bird communities, populations, and behavior in response to anthropogenic stressors. In addition to bird conservation, Harry is interested in avian natural history, including foraging, nesting, social behavior, and habitat associations of understudied species as a way of improving management. His current work focuses on monitoring bird populations in the Southern Colorado Plateau Network National Parks, as you will hear about momentarily. Through all of this, Harry strives to foster collaboration with conservation professionals to translate his research to management outcomes and to mentor future conservation professionals through career advising and capacity building of field skills. With that, I'll turn it over to him.
Thanks, Rachel, for that introduction. I'd like to apologize in advance if I'm going to have to turn off my video. My internet connection is not terribly great today, but hopefully that won't interfere at all with the talk. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my video and share my talk.
We're getting a little bit of a lag. I'll let you know when it's up.
Are we good to go?
We see your screen, so just go ahead and throw it in presentation mode and we'll be good to go.
Okay.
Great.
All right, so I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about some research that I conducted. I work for the Institute for Bird Populations, and part of my job is doing this long-term monitoring of bird populations in national parks of the Four Corners region. That entails working in a diversity of habitats, and it also entails working very closely with the National Park Service's inventory and monitoring network, specifically the Southern Colorado Plateau network. So the network of parks in the Four Corners area. And I'm going to present some results on bird population trends over time, over a 12-year period, and how bird populations in the Southwest are affected by two different climate drivers. One would be drought and the other one being changes to the timing of our monsoon rains. So as I'm sure many or all of you are aware, we are going through a biodiversity crisis, and birds, but also many other taxa are declining in abundance. So a recent and very widely cited paper found 29% overall reduction in bird abundance in North America, and over 60% of species in decline. And while there are a diversity of reasons for these declines, climate change is one major driver. And a recent review paper from 2020 found that 2/3 of North American birds are at risk from one or many effects of climate change. So one of those that I want to focus on is what I'm going to term hot drought. And that's when we get drought paired with very high temperatures, which in the Southwest, we're no strangers to this phenomenon. So you can see in this figure that there are hundreds of bird species that are predicted to be very vulnerable to extreme spring heat. And in the Southwest, that's often paired with lack of precipitation. So this hot drought can have direct effects on populations. It can result in mortality from dehydration, but it can also have direct effects on how successfully birds can reproduce. And it indirectly affects birds by having changes to their habitat, which might increase or decrease habitat suitability for wildlife. And that's where I think this is related to forestry and management. And in addition to drought, another major climatic factor in the Southwest is the North American monsoon. So as I'm sure everybody is aware, this is a big pulse of precipitation that typically occurs in Arizona and New Mexico starting in July and running roughly through September. And it's strongest actually in northwestern Mexico in the Sonora state, where up to 50 to 60% of the yearly rainfall comes in this pulse of monsoon precipitation. Typically, this falls in the form of violent downpours, violent thunderstorms, and it is a major part of ecology of our region. So climate models have had a very hard time predicting what will happen to the North American monsoon with climate change. But there are several models that predict both more variability in terms of the timing and also a later arrival of the monsoon rains compared to historical trends. So that translates into more rainfall in the latter half of the monsoon period, which would be in August and September, and less rainfall in the earlier months, which would be June and July. And why is this important for birds? Well, most of the birds in our region are migratory species. And we also know that in the Western United States, many of the bird species are what are termed molt migrants. So that means that these birds have a stopover molt. Molting is, of course, when birds lose their feathers and regrow their flight feathers. It's a very important event in their yearly cycle. And so these birds would breed in the Southwest. Then they migrate to the Sonoran region, the monsoon region, molt their feathers, replace their feathers, and then continue to migrate south to another non-breeding location, as illustrated by this black-headed grosbeak in the figure. And what's significant about this is that these birds time their arrival in Sonora, in the monsoon region, with the major pulse of precipitation from the monsoon. So they're benefiting from this big green up, and you can see in the figure in the upper right here that the enhanced vegetation index actually peaks just before that dotted line peaks just before the grosbeak arrives in Sonora. So it's taking advantage of this big green up effect that occurs when the monsoon rains fall to have a lot of resources to successfully molt its feathers. And so earlier rains should actually benefit these birds, and later rains could be detrimental to their molt. So we were essentially asking three broad questions with this research. One is just trying to understand what are populations of birds in monitored parks. Are they stable? Are they increasing? Are they decreasing? Second, how are the breeding densities of these birds affected by our two climate variables, drought and monsoon rain timing? And third, do we see different climate effects across our elevational gradient, across our different habitat types, and also across birds that are molt migrants and not molt migrants? So to set the stage for where these data were collected, where we're working, we are in the Southern Colorado Plateau Network, so in the Four Corners region of the Southwest, which encompasses a large diversity of parks. We have bird monitoring data from 6 of them, which are Grand Canyon National Park, Wupatki National Monument, Petrified Forest National Park, Canyon de Chelly National Monument, Mesa Verde National Park, and Bandelier National Monument. And what's interesting about this is that in each park, the monitoring selected focal habitats. So we actually have the full elevational gradient of habitats encompassed in our monitoring sites. So in Wupatki and Petrified Forest, we have these low elevation grassland shrubland sites. On the south rim of the Grand Canyon and at Mesa Verde, we have middle elevation pinyon juniper woodland. And then on the north rim and at Bandelier, the monitoring data come from mixed conifer forest, so across a diversity of elevations. And I should mention there was also monitoring data from riparian woodlands in Canyon de Chelly. So there's 4 habitat types that were monitored. We used this data set that was collected from 2007 to 2018, so a relatively broad period of time. And each park was sampled for birds every 3 years. The methods for collecting this data are really standard in the bird world. So these were unlimited radius point counts. It's basically walking to a point, and every bird that you see and hear gets recorded during 8 minutes. Additional data were collected, horizontal distance, which allows us to estimate how far away from the observer each bird is, and then the minute of first detection, and that is useful for modeling the detectability of birds. And then they visited each of these points at least twice per season. And so we took these bird monitoring data and we paired them with climate variables, as I mentioned. So it's really important to think about how we expect climate to be affecting bird populations, right? And so we took a year before to a year time lag because we assumed that climate would affect the number of baby birds that are being born. And so you would see the effect positive or negative the next year. And then we also compared the climate in a given year to the 30-year normal period of 1970 to 2000. So it's not in an absolute sense whether it's dry or wet, it's whether it's dry or wet for this particular site compared to that normal period. And as I mentioned, there were two climate factors that we were really interested in. So one is this hot drought, and we quantified that using climatic moisture deficit. So the water that plants are losing to evapotranspiration that's not being replaced by precipitation. And what's nice about this measure is that it includes both temperature and rainfall or precipitation in the measure, and higher values are indicating more drought-like conditions, more hot drought-like conditions. So we know that both temperature and rainfall play a big role in both direct mortality of birds, but also how much prey there is, how many insects there are for parent birds to feed their young. And that's going to affect how many young survive and what the nest success or the number of young that are fledged from each nest is. And second, we created this index of monsoon timing. So we looked at precipitation in June and July, and then we divided that by how much rainfall fell in August and September. So here, positive values on this are indicating an earlier rainfall of monsoon rainfall relative to normal for that particular location. And again, there's kind of two factors at play here. One is when you have earlier monsoons, you have more prey, insect prey on the breeding grounds, which is good, but it also probably leads to earlier green up timing on the molting grounds for those molt migrants. And so both of these things play into how many young birds are surviving and are being recruited into the breeding population the next year. And to analyze these data, we used a Bayesian model. It's an end mixture model, so it's a model of abundance. It's giving us density. And I won't go into a lot of the details of the modeling effort, but if you have questions, feel free to bug me about it after. We modeled species with 100 or more detections, so that was 50 bird species across our time series. And this model, broadly speaking, it accounts for imperfect detection. So we know we're not detecting birds perfectly in the field, and we're trying to account for imperfect observer detection. And it also can estimate density in years where there was no data collected because we can obtain climate variables for those years. So it's basically spitting out three different things. So there's two components of detectability, which I won't go into great detail about, but essentially these are ways of measuring how detectable the bird is based on its singing rate and the ability of an observer to perceive it in the field. But really what we care about here, the bread and butter of this work, density. So actually measuring a breeding season, estimating a breeding season density in terms of number of birds per survey area during the breeding season. And that's like our currency of how well bird populations are doing. So jumping in directly to some results, the biggest takeaway message I think from this was we're seeing striking declines in mixed conifer forest birds at the two parks that we were monitoring. So we can estimate population trend using a year effect. So this is a measure of population trend over time after accounting for climate variables. And so these are habitat-specific trends, not park-wide trends, because they did habitat-specific monitoring with this data. So I need to stress that. We do see a lot of variation in the population trend across our different habitat categories, which is quite intriguing. So there's some species increasing, some species decreasing, but when we break it down by habitat type, we start to see really strong trends where these high elevation mixed conifer forest birds are declining, the low elevation species and the middle elevation pinyon juniper species tend to be increasing. So there's this seems to be a relationship between declining and lower elevation birds increasing, a relationship between trend and breeding elevation, in other words, for these birds. And I like this figure because it kind of shows that more clearly over time. So here we have the birds broken down into habitat categories. So the birds that are pinyon juniper specialists, for example, are shown in light green here. And the arrows, red and green, are indicating the number of species that showed supported or significant, quote unquote, invasion speak, increases or decreases over time. And the big takeaway is that a lot of stuff is actually increasing over time in national parks, but that these high elevation species are not doing well. We also wanted to know, how are birds in national parks doing population-wise compared to the same bird species in terms of their regional population trends? And so this is a bit of a complex figure, so I'm going to try and break it down for you. On the bottom here, we have the breeding bird survey trend. So that's a regional trend for the entire Colorado Plateau region. And then on the y-axis, we have our park-specific, or park-wide rather, across park trend that we estimated from the monitoring data. So if we look at the 4 quadrants here, we can see that birds in this upper right-hand quadrant, for example, are increasing both regionally on the Colorado Plateau and locally in our focal parks. And then we also have situations where species might be increasing regionally but decreasing in our focal parks. And those species for our parks tend to be these spruce fir forest associated birds, which are very high elevation birds, ruby-crowned kinglet and red-breasted nuthatch. And in the upper left-hand quadrant, we have birds that are decreasing on the Colorado Plateau, but doing quite well on our monitoring plots. And these tend to be birds associated with very open woodland structure. So white-breasted nuthatch and chipping sparrow, for example, don't particularly like dense, dark, deep forests. They want kind of open, park-like structure with a grassy understory and sparse pines. And then we also had a species that was declining locally and regionally, which is not a forest bird. It's a brewer's sparrow, but showed an alarming 79% decline. This is a species of low elevation sagebrush. So overall, though, we find that there's a pretty strong, in fact, significant correlation between the local trends and the regional trends. And this is suggesting that there's nothing special about the populations that are occurring in our national parks. They're actually responding in very similar ways to birds regionally, which is somewhat alarming because it suggests that a lot of the drivers of population change are climate related, and that being in a protected area is not having a major effect on population trends over this time period, whether or not you're in a national park or outside of one. And so then we wanted to know, okay, what species are declining broadly speaking, and what features do they have in common? So again, I mentioned that there's some of these birds that are strongly associated with subalpine conifers, so subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce, which are not doing well at all. They seem to be particularly affected by drought, and there's a lot of mortality, at least in the sites that were monitored. There's also birds that nest in young conifers, especially firs. So they want this younger conifers, and it's possible that recruitment of young conifers is being affected by climate variables. We see birds that are sensitive to forest fragmentation, and these are all birds of high elevation mixed conifer forests. And then we also see birds that depend upon conifer masting or conifer seeds for part or all of the year are declining. By contrast, what seems to be increasing here? Well, I mentioned birds that like open woodlands, but also birds that like forest edges are doing very well in mixed conifer regions. When we look at the pinyon juniper specialty species, we find that species like juniper are increasing, they're doing quite well. And then even when we look at the grassland shrubland, we find that shrub nesting grassland species, as opposed to birds that nest on the ground or in grass clumps, are actually doing better, are increasing. And so this is really strongly suggesting that birds are strong indicators of changes to the structure of their habitat, and that species densities are reflecting climate-driven changes to structure from grasslands all the way up to mixed conifer forests, which is quite interesting but also alarming. So why are we seeing major declines of mixed conifer forests? Well, one, and I don't think this is going to come as a surprise to anybody here, is drought-associated tree death, and then of course the bark beetle outbreaks that accompany or follow after drought. So I'm sure everyone here is familiar with this, but not only does this result in heightened tree mortality, but also differential mortality across tree species, most likely, with a loss of subalpine tree species, and potentially also these large diameter trees are more affected by drought. Reduced recruitment of young conifers, as I mentioned, and potentially changes to the seed masting frequency or quantity of conifers at high elevation. And what certainly happens is that we're creating a more open forest structure, which will benefit some birds and also hurt others. And I also wanted to mention that there's likely very similar processes playing out in pinyon juniper woodlands with both die-off of pinyon pines and also dieback of pinyon pines and juniper, where we just see less canopy foliage. And in addition to drought-related tree death, we also just see high severity wildfire in the landscape. So we had a bit of a natural experiment in the sense that Bandelier, was hit by the high severity Las Conchas fire in the middle of our monitoring time series here, and we got to see what happened before and after this mega fire, as well as on the Kaiba Plateau. There have been large fires, and so this is, at least in the short term, leading to a loss of forest habitat, most likely though also leading to type conversion to non-forest habitats. And where forest does persist, likely a conversion to aspen-dominated forest, at least in the short term. So again, it's photos from Bandelier, and you're seeing 10 plus years after the fire, a lack of regeneration, but also a fragmentation of remaining habitat and creation of additional edge habitat. So I'd be remiss in not mentioning that, of course, there are some birds that greatly benefit from fire on the landscape, not universally a negative thing, but we do seem to find strong declines after this fire at Bandelier, and that for many of the mixed conifer bird species, a high severity fire of this magnitude was a net negative. Turning a little bit to drought and its effects on birds, we actually found a surprising result that drought had a very positive effect on birds. So we expected that would not be the case, but overall, birds seem to benefit a lot from drought. And again, the effects were very habitat specific. So mixed conifer forest birds love drought, which, how could this be, right? Like, we think that drought is very negative for them, but we found a very positive effect of drought on their populations the next year. The middle elevation species, there was no effect. And then for the low elevation species, we had a no effect or negative effects. So as well as many of these generalists, which tended to be species of higher elevations. And so when we put it all together, we actually see that there's a significant relationship between the average breeding elevation of a bird species, denoted on the x-axis here, and the effect of drought. So if what we are seeing here is the mean effect and the 95% critical interval. So if this interval overlaps 0, that means that the effect wasn't significant. And if the mean is above or below 0, it had a positive effect on populations if it's above the dotted line there, dashed line, and a negative effect if it's below. So we see that actually these high elevation species are benefiting from drought, and there's really no effect at middle elevation. And then at lower elevation, we tend to see negative effects of drought. So if we're also concerned about drought, and drought is a terrible thing, why is it having such a positive effect on high elevation montane birds? And the answer likely has to do with reduced snowpack. So we do know that in some studies that were carried out in the Sierra Nevada, that earlier snowmelt occurs in drought years. So not only is there less snow, but the snow melts more quickly, and that can lead to an 18-day earlier breeding phenology. So if you get an 18-day head start on your breeding, that's a really positive thing as a montane bird. You can have a second brood, meaning you could reproduce twice and put out a bunch of babies. You could have larger clutches, so lay more eggs and have more of those eggs survive and fledge from the nest. And then you don't have these early season cold snaps, which might lead to mortality of both adults and young. But of course, the short-term benefits of droughts are also need to be contrasted with the long-term effects of drought, which may be killing off the very trees that these birds depend on to breed in. So there's this future question of like, how much are short-term gains being outweighed by long-term losses due to drought-related tree mortality? And then on the other end of the scale, down in the grasslands, what's going on? Why is drought so negative down there? Well, effects of drought are especially negative for these ground nesting species. So what you're looking at here is the nest of a horned lark, and it nests in grass clumps. It doesn't nest in shrubs. And so in years where you have drought, there's just less grass. So not only is it harder to conceal the nest, but it likely also results in less prey availability. So we also found that aerial birds, flying birds, were more affected by drought than other grassland species. So again, like I said, drought is going to reduce the amount and the height of grass, which is a serious issue if the survival of your babies depends on hiding them in grass. It also is going to lead to mortality of the parents from heat stress. And when parents are heat stressed, they aren't able to provision, in other words, bring food to their young as frequently because they're overheating. And so that may also mean that the young get less food and are less likely to survive. So we think that extended drought is likely to impact grassland species in the future. And pivoting to my third point, the monsoon rains and their effects on birds. So on average, there's a strong effect of monsoon rains, but if we break it down by species, in fact, we find a lot of positive and negative effects across the board. And here, once again, and this is one of the main themes of this talk, hopefully it's coming across, is that effects of climate on birds appear to be very habitat specific. So again, for these high elevation mixed conifer forest birds, there's a positive effect of earlier monsoons. In the middle elevations, which is again a trend, there were very little effects of climate on pinyon juniper specialist species. And then we find a very strong negative effect of earlier monsoons on grassland shrubland birds. So let's see. Again, the generalists are variable, but those generalist birds are birds that were found in multiple habitats, and so it's hard to make a sweeping generalizations about them. All right, so why do earlier monsoon rains seem to have such negative impacts on grassland birds? Well, here is a shot of the monsoon rains falling at Petrified Forest National Park. There's a lot of literature across North America that finds that storms are negatively linked to grassland bird nest survival. So why might that be? Well, for one thing, there's not a lot of cover on this kind of landscape. So when you have these torrential downpours, you can have flooding of the nest. That can also lead to hypothermia in young because young birds can't thermoregulate like their parents. So they're dependent on their parents to brood them until they get to a certain age, and getting doused with cold rain is not good for them. And then there's also, again, this effect on provisioning. So when it's raining very strongly, parents can't be delivering food to the nest, and they're forced to wait until after it rains, and then they're provisioning a lot. And so the more trips they make to the nest, the more likely a predator is to see them and to find the nest and find a delicious snack. And then again, there's even evidence that the higher humidity of the rains may increase nest smell, and so that could spell doom for young nestlings as well. So what's the take home from all this is that grassland birds overall likely will benefit from delayed monsoons, that earlier monsoons are not actually benefiting these species. And we wanted to know also what the effects of earlier monsoons are on these molt migrants, these birds that migrate to Sonora to molt before continuing further south. And so we were able to find a measure of whether or not the birds molt on their breeding grounds. So on this graph, species that are on the right-hand side, they molt where they breed, which is in the Southwest if they're southwestern breeders. And birds that are on the left-hand side molt outside the breeding grounds. That could be anywhere. It could be in Mexico. It could also be in South America. So it's just a measure of whether they molt on the breeding grounds. And then again, on the y-axis here, you're seeing the effect of monsoon timing on the birds. So a positive value, if the point is above the dashed line here, it means that earlier monsoon rains have a positive effect on populations of this species the next year. And similarly, if they're below the dashed line, there's a negative effect of earlier monsoon rains. And we actually find a significant effect of earlier monsoon rains on populations the next year for species that breed outside of that molt outside of the breeding grounds. In other words, the birds in this upper left-hand quadrant. And there were some outliers in this, and those species are not birds that molt in the monsoon region. So if we exclude the birds that don't molt in the monsoon region, we find a strong trend that earlier monsoon rains are good for molt migrants. Why is that? Well, again, like I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, earlier monsoon rains tend to lead to more food on the molting grounds because there's more green up. And we do know that these birds that have the stopover molt migration actually have the fastest molt of any North American species. So they time it to molt, they arrive during peak green up, they molt really fast, and then they keep going south. And birds that molt on the breeding grounds can molt more slowly at their leisure because they're not trying to time it up with this climate phenomenon. And we also know that the young birds of these molt migrant species tend to arrive later than their parents, and they molt even faster. So they're in this situation where they're trying to play catch up. They may have even been born a month earlier, and they are flying down to Mexico and molting very quickly and trying to arrive at a point in time when there's a lot of resources. But what happens when the monsoon rains come late is that these birds may be mistiming their movements to Mexico. So they're in Sonora, but the monsoon rains have not yet arrived and the pulse of insect resources isn't there. And that could lead to a potential phenological mismatch, just like when birds are arriving in the spring and they're arriving too late because green up and leaf out has already occurred. All right, so what are some take-home points from all of this? One is that we're seeing pretty strong and alarming declines of mixed conifer bird populations, especially here in these monitoring sites on the very southern edge of their breeding range. And this is likely due to a combination of high severity wildfire, which we did capture in some of the monitoring data, as well as a drought-related tree mortality events that are affecting elements, either tree species or structural elements of the habitat that are important for these high elevation birds. And then we know that climate change effects on habitat. So climate change affects habitat indirectly, and that can drive both declines and increases. So there are winners and losers from this scenario. Most importantly, I think, is knowing that climate effects vary by elevation and habitat, and so we can't generalize the effects of climate on habitat structure, on wildlife populations. There's no universal response that we, as you might expect, that we're getting a very large amount of variation over a very large elevational gradient. One thing that we can expect in the future is that drought years are likely to benefit mixed conifer birds in the short term, though as I mentioned, the short-term benefits versus long-term costs of that are likely are an unknown. We don't know exactly how that's going to shake out. So more research is needed to understand if the die-offs associated with drought are really canceling out the positive effects of drought in the short term. And I think it's also important to note that a lot of these molt migrants, these birds that are essentially have a breeding grounds, a molting grounds, and a non-breeding grounds, are very vulnerable to later monsoon rains, just as grassland birds are vulnerable to earlier monsoon rains. And that there's not been a lot of discussion of how the molting grounds and the monsoons are affecting populations in conservation plans for these species. So keeping in mind the importance of monsoons potentially and the importance of what's happening in Sonora for the populations of these molt migrants, I think is an important factor in the conservation of these species. So I won't take up too much more of your time with my chit chat. I'm really happy to answer any questions if anyone has any.
Great, thank you so much, Harry. That was a great presentation and you covered a lot of ground. So I know we'll have some great questions coming in the chat. I'll go ahead and kick it off with a question from Xander, who asked if Pinyon Jay was in your survey and if you can comment at all on the specific drought impacts on the Pinyon Jay.
Yeah, so obviously Pinyon Jay is like becoming the new it bird for good reason. It's probably going to be maybe listed in the very near future. Unfortunately, Pinyon Jays are very hard to monitor from point count data because they have very large home ranges of like 3,000 to 4,000 hectares, and they like to move around in very large flocks, which breaks a lot of the statistical assumptions of these models. But there is strong evidence that Pinyon Jays are being affected by drought on a number of fronts. One of those being that the drought is killing off pinyon pines differentially, and actually there's additional work on that that's currently in review, where we're looking at effects of structural changes and changes to species composition of trees on birds in pinyon juniper. So quick plug for that, that hopefully will be coming out later this year. But yeah, so the pinyon pines are more affected obviously by drought than junipers, and that strongly affects the pinyon jay. Pinyon jays like to nest in denser pinyon pine stands, and even when not all the pinyon pines die, you often see a natural thinning of these stands due to drought. So they're losing breeding habitat, they're losing the tree they're mutualists with, and then drought is probably affecting the masting events of the pinyon pine as well. So there's fewer pinyon seeds, and what they feed their young is in good years are those pinyon seeds. So when the tree's mast, as you may all know this, but they will cache those seeds. So they just gather tons and tons of them, and then they cache them in the ground, and they actually can breed really early. It can start breeding in February because they're feeding their young these like highly nutritious pine nuts. But in years where the masts fail, they can't do that, and so they have to feed them insects, and they have to wait and breed later. So overall, pinyon jay is like the worst possible combination of negative climate change effects on their very unique ecology, unfortunately.
Yeah, and you may see in the chat, Xander said, please share that research when it's available, and thank you for diving into that. So kind of on a related note, you just mentioned that pinyon jay are difficult to monitor via point count data, and I know that this probably applies to other species as well. So if you're willing to dive into it, how do you think managers can react to better monitor bird population and maybe behavior in their project areas for species to whom that might apply?
So, I mean, for pinion jays, the reality I think is that these kind of universal, a lot of what we do are these passive point counts, where for most of your songbirds, you are able to capture a wide breadth of species with passive surveys and these using community level, community-wide survey techniques. There are, I think, some species that are particularly difficult to monitor that way, and pinion jays are one because, again, the flocking and the large size, so you need a pinion jay specific survey protocol. There is a pinion jay working group in the Western United States that just developed one, and in consultation with many pinion jay experts, and that was published last year, I believe. So there is a protocol out there that's available, and which I would encourage people to use if they want to do pinion jay specific inventory or monitoring. And then as far as other groups that might require more specific or species specific monitoring, I think probably birds of prey and owls are one also where you're not going to get good data from community-wide surveys. And so I assume things like spotted owl and American goshawk and things like that are also ones where you would want species specific surveys and playback surveys to determine occupancy and density and things like that. I don't know if I'm answering your question adequately here, Rachel.
No, that was good. Thank you so much, Harry. All right, so Colin just asked, you mentioned that you were monitoring both before and after the Los Conchas fire in Bandelier. Can you speak to any of the species changes that you saw in the area post-fire?
Yeah, I mean, it's been very intriguing. So the area not only there's been a net loss of forest cover for sure. Many of the areas that were once forest are now grassland with snags. There's also areas that have been converted into aspen stands or aspen and New Mexico locust dominated stands, which seems to be a new and quite frankly awful habitat type to bushwhack through. And so we're actually seeing the emergence of like shrublands and grasslands in a landscape that I think was strongly dominated by forest. There are natural grasslands up there. So we've seen a net loss of forest, and we've seen that the forest that remains tends to be more open, more resembling a ponderosa pine woodland. And then also it seems to me that there's been a shift in a greater increase in understory shrubs because of a loss of canopy cover and a shift away from things like subalpine fir, Engelmann spruce, and limber pine, and towards the lower elevation, more drought tolerant conifers. So the big winners are things like ponderosa pine and, from what I can tell, white fir. And you're actually seeing a shift in the birds. So things like white-breasted nuthatch, which has actually invaded, or it's actually moved upslope, and Plumbiaspheria, which is another bird strongly tied to these open habitats, park-like habitats, are moving upslope. And birds that are really strongly tied to the shrubs, like Virginia's warbler, are moving upslope, and they're moving in. So we're actually seeing birds there now that were not there 15, 20 years ago before the fire. And so we've also seen a strong decline in the spruce fir associated bird species. And so like golden crown kinglet, which is kind of the poster child for wants to be around spruce, is nearly extirpated from the site. There's very few records after the fire. So I think there are major changes to the structure and the species composition of the forest there, and the birds are just following, where there's big winners, there's big losers as well.
Yeah, and we won't get into it now, but there's some good webinars from other organizations such as the Southwest Fire Science Consortium that specifically speak to the ecological transitions that we see post-fire and some of the management strategies associated with that. All right, so we have a pretty small group. If anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, please feel free to. Otherwise, I'll just throw out one more that I have. I was wondering if Do you know of any other research looking at the impact of climate on forage availability and how that may impact avian populations? It sounded like that was sort of this common thread that kept emerging through monsoons, drought, heat.
You mean specifically for like insect populations and okay. Yeah, there's very little that's been done on insect populations in general, and obviously entomologists have been talking about major insect die-offs and such, and there is not good long-term monitoring data for that. But it's probably safe to assume that when we see changes to bird populations, they are reflecting in some manner or form either changes to where they can nest, because the nesting site might be very important, or changes to the amount of food that's available to feed the young, because that is a major driver of how many young you can raise and how successfully you can raise those young. So there's not a lot of good research on that. And in fact, like more research tying insect populations to bird populations in general is really needed, because it's like a big assumption that we're making. And sometimes those are right, and sometimes assumptions are very dangerous. So, and I wish there were more on that topic.
All right, well, we'll all keep an eye out to see if you bring up anything. And it looks like Xander may have a couple more that he would like to throw your way.
Yeah, I can't resist. Harry, first of all, great presentation. I'm learning a lot, and maybe you'll indulge my lack of knowledge. Can you share just a little bit of an insight about how birds are able to respond to, say, that mismatch of timing and resources and their historic migrations, etc.? I just have, not knowing a lot about birds, I have no sense of whether they can react quickly or, whether they're pretty inflexible.
Well, I think there's a lot of question marks. So we do know more about their migration in the spring, right? When they're returning from their non-breeding grounds to their breeding grounds, that the main key of like when they migrate is day length. So these birds are leaving Central America or Northern South America, and they're basing their departure times on the day length, and that's driving their hormones and their desire to migrate. But then that may result in a mismatch between day length and actual temperature and the phenology of the plants where they're arriving and where they're breeding. So when that mismatch grows, you get arrival of birds at places. They're trying to time their arrival right when these trees are leafing out, because the leaves are less protected by chemicals. There's a lot of caterpillars and insects, and that's when you want to like have that's the major food pulse that you're feeding to your young. So if you're arriving too late, you're missing that major pulse, and you're kind of getting the tail end of it. So that's the spring phenological mismatch that might be occurring. And then as far as what's happening during the molting season, again, it's not been very well studied, in part because like a lot of it happens in the mountains of northwestern Mexico. But it's very likely that there's a similar phenomenon. And I don't know what the driver is for when these birds are like deciding, okay, it's time for me to migrate south to the monsoon region. But you would assume that there's a very strong selection to migrate exactly when those rains are falling, because if you get there too late, you've missed that same pulse. But the problem is that it's potentially the monsoon rains are less reliable or less stable, so they can arrive really early or really late from one year into the next, and that the timing that always worked for the last 500,000 years is now not working so well because you're either too early or too late. But it's not well understood, that whole phenomenon, and until recently we didn't even have a good understanding of which species do it. So it's been a bit kind of a neglected. There's been a lot of focus obviously on the non-breeding season and where are these birds overwintering, as there should be, but there's not been enough focus probably on where are they molting, because that can have a major effect on the survival of the young birds, the first year birds that were born over the summer. So I feel like I've given a lot of, we don't know, but there's a lot more to learn on that topic.
Well, and just building on that, are people seeing evidence of shifting migration timing to kind of better match as climate shifts, or is that likely to take so long that we're not going to see it yet?
Well, in the spring migration, we have seen evidence of that. There have been some really great studies using big data across North America that have found that some of these birds are actually arriving like up to a week, 10 days earlier than they used to, and they are able to respond. The problem is that the birds that overwinter in the southeast or in the southwest, these short distance migrants, have more capacity to respond quickly. The ones that are overwintering in the Andes of South America and have a long ways to go, it's harder for them to like adjust their migration timing quickly. So it's largely a question of where they overwinter and their natural history is, like where are they short or long distance migrating. But yeah, we have seen shifts, and that is a promising thing. That, I mean, I always tell people these migratory birds, like the amount of variation in climate and habitat that they see in the course of 1 year is much larger than most animals. So because they're experiencing a variety of climates and a variety of habitats, and I think that also makes them more resilient to changes in their habitat. Unfortunately, some of the stuff that's like specialized and is like in these high elevation environments and doesn't see as much variation over the course of years, like the yearly cycle is, I think, what's most at risk, is because they don't have this built-in natural variation, and so they don't have a very good, they're not as resilient, most likely.
That's really helpful. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and I just, we have just a couple more minutes, so I want to build off of Xander's question a little bit. He was talking about, have you seen any shifts in migration timing? And I'm going to ask something that there might not be a whole lot of research on because you're doing this research at specific sites. Have you or other researchers seen any shifts in migration locations? So, you know, we have the typical grounds that birds return to year after year, but have you seen any shift there as a response?
Well, that is hard to know because sure, you really have to put like transmitters on birds to like know, are they changing where they're breeding, or like are different populations changing when they migrate. I suspect that stuff like that probably is happening, that birds of the same species that are breeding in the Southwest already, we know, have different migration timing from, so the same species that breeds in the mountains in New Mexico and in, say, Washington State, the birds in Washington State actually arrive like a week or so earlier because the climate is milder, they follow the coast up. So we know there's differences in migration timing across different populations of the same species. And it's likely that there will be shifts occurring within these populations, but it's expensive to track movements of birds, and so there hasn't been enough study on like exactly how they're moving and how climate change is affecting that. But I do suspect that like the birds that we have in our region, in the mountains of our region, are on the southern edge, the warm edge of their breeding range, are showing big changes compared to birds that are further north that are comparatively unaffected. It's just a guess for now. Unfortunately, there's not enough data.
All right, well, I'm so glad that you came on to share the data that you do have, that you gave this really excellent presentation. I'm excited to see those research briefs when they come out. We will share those out. This recording will be posted to YouTube, and when the briefs come out, we'll share them there in the YouTube description as well. So Harrison, thank you so much for taking the time today. Thank you everyone online for taking the time to join us, and we look forward to the next one.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, take care.